The moment the doctor stepped out of the intensive care unit, the entire hospital corridor seemed to lose its breath. Before anyone could process the devastating update about Jungkook's condition, Taehyung's face drained of every trace of color, and his body collapsed onto the cold floor without warning. Jimin stood frozen, unable to move as guilt, fear, and unanswered questions crashed over him all at once. None of them realized that the truth hidden behind Jungkook's fragile condition had been silently tearing their bond apart for weeks. As the silence inside the hospital grew heavier than grief itself, only one question remained. What heartbreaking secret had finally shattered everything they believed about each other? For years, the bond between Jimin and Jungkook had become something everyone around them quietly relied upon, not because it was perfect, but because it had survived countless storms that would have broken most relationships. Their friendship had grown through endless rehearsals, sleepless nights, exhausting tours, and moments when the weight of expectations threatened to consume them both. Even when words became unnecessary, a single glance between them often carried enough understanding to calm the chaos surrounding their lives. The other members had long accepted that whenever one of them faltered, the other would instinctively step forward without hesitation. It was a rhythm that had become so natural no one imagined it could ever change. Yet beneath that familiar comfort, invisible cracks had already begun spreading through emotions neither of them fully understood. Jungkook had become increasingly quiet in recent weeks, hiding his exhaustion behind reassuring smiles that fooled almost everyone except Jimin, who noticed the subtle hesitation in every movement, the lingering fatigue behind those determined eyes, and the growing distance that appeared whenever conversations became too personal. Jimin convinced himself that Jungkook simply needed time, believing patience would eventually bring back the warmth that had always defined their connection. Instead, every attempt to get closer seemed to push Jungkook even farther away. The silence between them slowly transformed into something unfamiliar, something heavy enough to make every shared room feel colder than before. While the others continued focusing on demanding schedules and public appearances, they sensed an unusual tension lingering beneath the surface. RM watched with quiet concern whenever the two unconsciously avoided standing beside each other. Jean tried to restore the familiar atmosphere with laughter and comforting meals, hoping ordinary moments could heal invisible wounds. Suga noticed the restless expressions that appeared whenever Jungkook believed no one was looking. J-Hope filled every rehearsal with encouragement, refusing to let discouragement settle over the group. Taehyung remained the one who observed everything without forcing answers, trusting that the truth would eventually reveal itself when the time was right. Unknown to everyone, Jungkook had already begun carrying a burden far heavier than anyone could imagine. What started as occasional dizziness had quietly evolved into frightening episodes of weakness that he stubbornly dismissed as exhaustion. Each time his vision blurred or his heartbeat became strangely irregular, he convinced himself that resting later would solve everything. He refused to become another source of worry for the people he cared about most. The thought of interrupting their hard-earned momentum felt unbearable, so he buried every symptom beneath determination, believing sacrifice was simply another responsibility he had to accept. Jimin sensed that something was terribly wrong but misread Jungkook's growing distance as emotional withdrawal rather than hidden suffering. Every unanswered message, every canceled meal together, and every distracted expression slowly planted seeds of doubt inside his heart. Questions began replacing certainty. Had Jungkook grown tired of depending on him? Had their once unshakable trust quietly faded without either of them realizing it? Those thoughts haunted Jimin far more than he admitted, causing his own silence to deepen with every passing day. Neither of them realized they were protecting the other in completely different ways, while unintentionally building an invisible wall that neither knew how to cross. Then came the day everything changed. During what was supposed to be another ordinary schedule, Jungkook suddenly lost his balance without warning. His knees buckled beneath him before anyone could react, and the confident smile he had worn only moments earlier disappeared into unconsciousness. Panic erupted instantly as the members rushed toward him, their hearts sinking at the terrifying realization that this was far more serious than simple exhaustion. The frantic journey to the hospital unfolded in stunned silence, each passing minute stretching into unbearable uncertainty. As emergency staff disappeared behind the intensive care unit doors with Jungkook, the remaining members found themselves trapped in a hallway where hope and fear collided with every second that passed. None of them knew that the doctor's upcoming words would expose a truth far more devastating than illness alone, a truth capable of shaking every relationship they had spent years protecting. The waiting room gradually transformed into a place where time no longer followed ordinary rules. Every passing minute felt painfully slow, stretching into an endless silence that magnified every anxious breath and every fearful thought. The bright hospital lights reflected against polished floors that suddenly felt colder than winter itself, while the steady rhythm of distant medical equipment echoed like relentless reminders that Jungkook's life now rested in uncertain hands. No one dared to voice the fear growing inside them, because speaking it aloud would make it feel painfully real. Jimin remained seated only for brief moments before rising again, pacing the narrow corridor, as though movement alone could outrun the crushing guilt tightening around his chest. His mind replayed every recent interaction with Jungkook in relentless detail. The unanswered messages, the forced smiles, the moments he had mistaken for emotional distance instead of silent cries for help all returned with unbearable clarity. What had once appeared to be indifference now revealed itself as exhaustion hidden behind extraordinary determination. Each memory became another sharp reminder that he had been standing beside someone who was quietly falling apart without ever recognizing the depth of the struggle. RM watched Jimin with growing concern, understanding that the younger man was carrying a burden far heavier than simple worry. Leadership had taught him that people often blamed themselves when tragedy struck, even when the truth was far more complicated. Yet this situation felt different. There was a fragile tension surrounding Jimin that suggested he had already begun punishing himself long before anyone else could offer comfort. Jean attempted to keep everyone's strength from collapsing completely by encouraging them to eat something, even if only a few bites, but untouched meals quickly cooled on the small table beside them. Suga leaned against the wall with folded arms, his calm expression unable to conceal the storm behind his eyes. J-Hope silently clasped his trembling hands together, refusing to let despair overwhelm the hope he desperately wanted to preserve. Taehyung stood closest to the intensive care unit doors, never taking his eyes away from the entrance, as though sheer determination could somehow will Jungkook back into safety. Hours earlier, before the emergency had unfolded, Taehyung had noticed something everyone else overlooked. Jungkook had quietly paused outside the rehearsal room after everyone else had gone inside, pressing one hand firmly against his chest while struggling to steady his breathing. The moment he realized someone might see him, he immediately forced another reassuring smile, dismissing the episode with effortless composure that now seemed painfully artificial. At the time, Taehyung had accepted the explanation because trust had always defined their relationships. Now that memory replayed over and over, refusing to leave him alone. Every detail became another unanswered question demanding an explanation that no one possessed. The doctor eventually emerged, not with the relief everyone had desperately hoped for, but with an expression so solemn that every heartbeat in the hallway seemed to stop. The medical team's efforts had stabilized Jungkook for the moment, yet his condition remained dangerously unpredictable. Severe physical exhaustion alone could not explain the collapse. Additional examinations had uncovered signs that his body had been enduring an intense medical problem for far longer than anyone realized, one that had silently worsened because treatment had been delayed. Those words struck the members with overwhelming force. The realization that Jungkook had carried such suffering in complete silence shattered every assumption they had made over the past several weeks. Jimin felt the floor beneath him become strangely unsteady. The countless moments when he had quietly questioned Jungkook's changing behavior now transformed into unbearable regret. Instead of reaching beyond the silence, he had allowed his own hurt feelings to create distance. Instead of insisting that Jungkook open his heart, he had respected boundaries that were never meant to exist. The guilt spread through him with suffocating intensity, convincing him that every missed opportunity had helped lead them to this terrifying hospital corridor. Before anyone could recover from the doctor's explanation, another revelation quietly surfaced. Hospital staff had discovered that Jungkook had repeatedly ignored medical recommendations after experiencing earlier symptoms. Appointment reminders had gone unanswered. Follow-up examinations had been postponed. Warning signs had been dismissed because he insisted other responsibilities came first. He had chosen everyone else's peace of mind over his own safety, believing that temporary suffering was easier to bear than becoming the reason his family-like bond with the members was interrupted. That heartbreaking pattern of silent sacrifice left the entire hallway frozen in disbelief. Taehyung slowly lowered his head as fragments of recent weeks finally connected into a devastating truth. He remembered the unexplained disappearances between schedules, the unusual fatigue after performances, the moments Jungkook quietly isolated himself while pretending everything remained perfectly normal. Every forgotten detail returned with crushing weight until the realization became impossible to withstand. His breathing became uneven, his vision blurred, and before anyone noticed the alarming change, his strength disappeared completely. His body collapsed onto the hospital floor just moments after understanding how much pain Jungkook had hidden from all of them. The sudden sound echoed through the silent corridor, replacing fear with outright panic. Medical staff rushed toward Taehyung, while Jimin stood paralyzed, overwhelmed by the horrifying realization that one devastating secret had now brought two of the people he cared about most to the edge of collapse. Yet even as chaos spread through the hospital once again, an even more shocking truth remained hidden within Jungkook's medical records, waiting to change everything they thought they knew about the sacrifices he had made. As nurses hurried Taehyung toward an examination room, the corridor became even quieter than before, as though the hospital itself had fallen into mourning. Jimin remained rooted in place, unable to tear his eyes away from the intensive care unit doors, while the image of Taehyung collapsing replayed relentlessly in his mind. It no longer felt as though they were facing a single tragedy. One hidden truth had triggered another, exposing just how fragile the strength they had all taken for granted had become. The members who had once stood together through every challenge were now scattered by fear, uncertainty, and the unbearable weight of unanswered questions. RM immediately stepped forward to restore a sense of order, speaking calmly with the medical staff, while making sure everyone received accurate updates instead of surrendering to panic. Jean quietly gathered bottles of water that no one touched, refusing to let small acts of care disappear even when they seemed meaningless. Suga stared through the large hospital window into the darkness outside, recognizing that silence often revealed more pain than tears ever could. J-Hope remained beside Jimin without saying a single word, understanding that some grief could not be comforted through reassurance alone. Each of them fought the same invisible battle, wondering how someone they loved so deeply had managed to suffer in complete isolation, while standing only a few steps away every single day. Several hours later, Taehyung slowly regained consciousness. His physical condition had stabilized quickly, but the emotional shock remained painfully visible in his exhausted expression. The doctor explained that overwhelming psychological stress had caused his sudden collapse, and strict rest was necessary to prevent further complications. Although relieved that Taehyung was no longer in immediate danger, the members recognized that his recovery depended not on medicine alone, but on the answers everyone was still desperately searching for. Before returning to the waiting area, Taehyung quietly requested permission to see the physician responsible for Jungkook's treatment. His determination was gentle yet unmistakable, driven not by curiosity, but by the desperate hope that understanding the truth might somehow lessen the crushing guilt consuming them all. After carefully reviewing legal permissions and medical considerations, the physician agreed to share limited information with the members. The explanation that followed transformed the atmosphere inside the consultation room into one of profound heartbreak. Jungkook's illness had not appeared suddenly. The condition had developed silently over many months, gradually placing dangerous strain on his body while producing symptoms that could easily be mistaken for ordinary fatigue. Medical specialists believed that timely treatment would have significantly reduced the risk of collapse, yet every opportunity for early intervention had quietly slipped away. More painful still was the discovery that Jungkook had repeatedly requested adjustments to his appointments whenever they conflicted with important group activities. He had convinced himself that delaying treatment was an acceptable sacrifice if it protected the people he loved from additional pressure. Those decisions, made out of loyalty rather than carelessness, had slowly pushed his body beyond its limits. The physician then revealed something that left every member unable to breathe for a moment. During one of Jungkook's earlier hospital visits, doctors had advised him to reduce his workload immediately and inform those closest to him about the seriousness of his condition. Instead, he had signed documents acknowledging the medical risks while insisting that the information remain confidential unless an emergency occurred. His greatest fear had never been the illness itself. He feared becoming the reason the group's carefully rebuilt stability would once again be overshadowed by worry and sacrifice. He believed that carrying the burden alone was the kindest choice he could make, never realizing that silence would eventually hurt everyone far more deeply than honesty ever could. Jimin lowered his head as the full meaning of those words settled into his heart. Every misunderstanding that had driven them apart suddenly appeared painfully insignificant compared to the loneliness Jungkook must have endured. He remembered moments when frustration had tempted him to believe their bond was fading, when disappointment had convinced him to step back instead of stepping closer. Each decision had been made without knowing the truth, yet ignorance offered no comfort now. Regret settled over him with crushing force because the distance between them had never been created by fading affection. It had been built by one person trying to protect everyone else and another believing that respect meant waiting for answers that would never come. Taehyung quietly closed his eyes, overwhelmed by memories that now carried entirely different meanings. Jungkook's unusually long pauses after rehearsals, the forced laughter despite visible exhaustion, the countless times he encouraged everyone else to rest while refusing to rest himself, all revealed the same heartbreaking pattern. What had once seemed like resilience was, in reality, a desperate attempt to preserve normality while his own strength slowly disappeared. The realization filled every corner of the room with a grief that words could never fully express. Yet before the members could process everything they had learned, another member of the medical team entered carrying additional examination results. The physician's expression revealed that there was still one final truth left undisclosed, a truth connected not only to Jungkook's illness, but also to a decision he had made only days before collapsing, one that would forever change the way Jimin understood the depth of Jungkook's unwavering devotion. The physician carefully placed the newly reviewed documents on the table before taking a slow, measured breath. No one in the room spoke. The silence had become so absolute that even the faint hum of the hospital ventilation seemed impossibly loud. Every member instinctively understood that whatever came next would be the final missing piece of a tragedy that had already reshaped every emotion they carried. Their attention remained fixed on the physician, whose solemn expression revealed that this was no ordinary medical explanation, but the disclosure of a deeply personal choice Jungkook had deliberately kept hidden from everyone he loved. According to the hospital records, only a few days before his collapse, Jungkook had quietly returned for another consultation after experiencing symptoms that had become impossible to ignore. Additional examinations confirmed that his condition had progressed faster than doctors had anticipated. They strongly recommended immediate treatment and complete suspension of every demanding activity for the foreseeable future. Continuing his schedule carried significant risks, including another sudden collapse that could become far more dangerous than the first. Yet despite hearing every warning, Jungkook had asked for only one thing before leaving the consultation room. He wanted enough time to fulfill what he believed were responsibilities that belonged not to himself, but to the people standing beside him every day. He had explained that recent weeks had already been emotionally difficult for everyone. He feared that stepping away without carefully preparing the others would leave them overwhelmed by uncertainty. More than protecting his own reputation, he wanted to preserve the confidence and stability of those he considered family. Every delayed appointment, every concealed symptom, and every exhausted smile had been part of that quiet determination. It was a decision born entirely from love, yet one that slowly demanded more from his body than it could possibly endure. The physician then revealed the detail that shattered Jimin completely. During that final consultation, Jungkook had privately asked the medical staff not to contact Jimin under any circumstances unless his life entered immediate danger. His request had not come from resentment or emotional distance. Instead, he had confessed that Jimin blamed himself too easily whenever someone close to him suffered. Jungkook feared that if Jimin discovered the seriousness of the illness too soon, he would abandon everything else and carry a guilt that did not belong to him. Even while facing frightening uncertainty about his own future, Jungkook's greatest concern had remained protecting Jimin from emotional pain. Hearing those words felt like watching every misunderstanding of the past several weeks collapse at once. Jimin's breathing grew unsteady as memories flooded back with devastating clarity. Every time Jungkook had quietly withdrawn, every forced smile that hid unbearable fatigue, every unanswered message that Jimin had mistaken for emotional distance had actually been another attempt to shield him from suffering. The wall between them had never been built by fading trust. It had been constructed by love expressed through silence, a silence that neither of them had understood until it was almost too late. Tears blurred Jimin's vision as regret settled into every corner of his heart. He realized that while he had been searching for explanations, Jungkook had been sacrificing pieces of himself simply to preserve everyone else's happiness. RM gently closed the medical file, recognizing that no further explanation could lessen the weight now resting upon them. Jean lowered his head, struggling to reconcile the cheerful resilience Jungkook had shown every day with the lonely battle he had been fighting in secret. Suga's composure finally gave way to quiet sorrow, as he accepted that strength without vulnerability could become its own form of suffering. J-Hope pressed his hands together, silently wishing that hope had reached Jungkook before exhaustion did. Taehyung looked toward the intensive care unit with renewed determination, no longer overwhelmed by helplessness, but by a profound desire to ensure that none of them would ever allow silence to replace trust again. Hours later, as dawn's first light slowly filtered through the hospital windows, a nurse hurried down the corridor with unexpected urgency. Jungkook's condition had shown its first meaningful sign of improvement. The change was small, fragile, and far from guaranteeing recovery, yet it was enough to awaken a hope that had nearly disappeared during the endless night. For the first time since the terrifying collapse, the members felt that despair no longer held complete control over their hearts. They understood that healing, like trust, would not happen in a single moment. It would require patience, honesty, forgiveness, and the courage to share burdens instead of hiding them. Standing together outside the intensive care unit, they silently promised themselves that no act of love would ever again be expressed through lonely sacrifice alone. Some wounds were created not by hatred, but by the mistaken belief that protecting others required suffering in silence. And perhaps the greatest lesson waiting beyond those hospital doors was that true family is not measured by how much pain one person can endure alone, but by the willingness to carry the pain together before it becomes too heavy for anyone to survive. The following days unfolded with agonizing patience as every small improvement in Jungkook's condition became a source of cautious hope rather than certainty. The intensive care unit remained a place where optimism and fear existed side by side, never allowing anyone to relax completely. Each update from the medical team was measured carefully, reminding the members that recovery would not be determined by hours or even days, but by the resilience of both Jungkook's body and the unwavering support waiting for him beyond the hospital doors. The atmosphere that had once been dominated by panic slowly transformed into one of quiet determination. No one spoke about returning to normal because they had all realized that normal no longer existed. Something fundamental had changed within every one of them. Jimin chose to remain at the hospital whenever regulations allowed, finding unexpected comfort in simply being close, even if separated by layers of glass, machines, and careful medical supervision. He no longer searched for ways to erase his guilt because he understood that regret could never rewrite the past. Instead, he allowed the guilt to become a promise that the future would be different. Every memory that had once tormented him gradually became another reminder to notice the smallest changes in the people he loved, to ask difficult questions instead of accepting reassuring smiles, and to remain present even when silence tried to convince him that everything was fine. RM quietly organized the members so none of them carried the emotional burden alone. Without making it feel like an obligation, he encouraged each person to rest, eat properly, and step outside the hospital for fresh air whenever exhaustion became visible. Leadership no longer meant solving impossible problems. It meant protecting the people who were still standing while they waited for the one who was still fighting. Jean filled the empty hours with small acts of kindness that required no recognition, preparing warm meals, leaving encouraging notes, and gently reminding everyone that hope often survived through ordinary gestures rather than dramatic declarations. Suga spent long periods sitting in thoughtful silence, reflecting on how easily strong people convinced themselves that vulnerability was weakness. The experience forced him to confront a painful truth shared by so many who devoted themselves entirely to others. Carrying every burden alone did not make someone stronger. It simply made it harder for those who loved them to offer help before it was too late. J-Hope became the quiet source of emotional balance, offering steady encouragement whenever despair threatened to return, while Taehyung, having recovered from his own collapse, devoted himself to remaining emotionally available for everyone around him. The frightening experience had changed him profoundly. He no longer ignored subtle signs of pain hidden beneath cheerful expressions. Instead, he listened more carefully, observed more gently, and understood that compassion sometimes meant noticing what remained unspoken. Nearly 2 weeks after Jungkook's collapse, the medical team finally delivered the update everyone had been praying for. The danger to his life had significantly decreased. Although a long period of treatment and rehabilitation still awaited him, his body had begun responding positively, giving doctors genuine confidence that recovery was possible if every recommendation was followed without compromise. Relief spread through the hallway with quiet tears rather than celebration. After everything they had endured, gratitude felt more appropriate than excitement. They had learned that survival itself was a miracle worthy of humility. When Jimin was finally allowed to spend a brief supervised visit beside Jungkook, the sight before him left an impression that would remain for the rest of his life. The strength that had always seemed endless was now replaced by visible fragility, yet beneath that exhaustion remained the unmistakable determination that had inspired everyone around him for years. In that silent moment, Jimin understood that genuine strength had never been about enduring endless pain without complaint. True strength was allowing oneself to heal, accepting care without shame, and trusting others enough to share burdens before they became impossible to carry. From that day forward, the members gradually rebuilt more than routines. They rebuilt the way they cared for one another. Success no longer came before health. Schedules no longer outweighed honest conversations. Whenever someone appeared unusually quiet, the silence was met not with assumptions, but with patient concern. The invisible walls that misunderstanding had created slowly disappeared, replaced by a deeper trust forged through shared heartbreak. The hospital that had witnessed their darkest night ultimately became the place where they rediscovered the meaning of family. They entered those halls believing love meant protecting others from pain at any cost. They left understanding that real love also required the courage to let others protect them in return. Jungkook's hidden sacrifices, Taehyung's heartbreaking collapse, and Jimin's overwhelming guilt became lasting reminders that silence can sometimes wound more deeply than truth. Although the scars of those days would never disappear completely, they no longer represented failure. They became symbols of growth, forgiveness, and a promise that no one among them would ever face unbearable suffering alone again. And long after the hospital lights faded behind them, one lesson remained stronger than every fear they had overcome. The people who matter most are never a burden to one another. The greatest act of loyalty is not sacrificing yourself until you collapse in silence, but trusting those who love you enough to let them stand beside you through every moment of darkness. If this story touched your heart, perhaps its message is worth carrying into your own life, because sometimes the strongest relationships are saved not by extraordinary heroes, but by the simple courage to ask for help before it is too late.